one tries.
A shadow of your former self.
Well, I wouldn't say that exactly.
Right, we all good?
Yeah. Hello from Valerie in Aycliffe. Aycliffe? That's not Newton Aycliffe. Sheffield, Burton-on-Trent, the Lakes. Gosh.
So we haven't even started on Facebook, and this has been the most popular event that we've done in Click Meeting so far. So just to let you know. Right, we are up and running. So Professor Dave Jones, OBE, good morning.
This is not a Thursday afternoon like it normally is. It's a Tuesday morning. The world has changed.
Good morning to you. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Good morning, Chief. How are you?
I'm grand. How's yourself?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. I'm good.
Good.
So I'm just going to open up Dave's slides, which you will see. So you'll see the slides in the main, and you'll see us at the side. And Dave, just when you're ready. So you should actually, can you see the slides? Or
I can, but I think you'll need to move them forward.
That's fine. I can do that.
Okay.
Oh, you, sir.
Okay, lovely. Well, good morning, everybody, from a unusually sunny Northumberland. Last time we spoke, there was about 3 inches of snow on my window, but today it's sun, which is different. For those of you who know Northumberland, that's very unusual. It's usually horizontal rain and wind. So this came about from a series of questions that we've been asked, and so we thought it was just useful to pull together a more formal thing around the gut or the bowel in PBC. And so what I'm going to do is just introduce some concepts with some slides, and then we'll take questions. So I thought it was a really interesting topic, and I think it probably reflects the fact that there are more issues in relation to this than sometimes are appreciated. So it's not something I don't necessarily think that people in the field think about, that the doctors think about terribly much. So what I've done is just to put some thoughts down, and then we'll take questions on it. So this is not a lecture or a erudite educational thing. It's just some thoughts from me, in the practice that we have. So next slide. This is my favorite working from home slide. So I live on a farm here, and it's just to make the point that, here we're all working from home, and actually some good things have come from this, such as these webinars and things like that. But working from home is a challenge for some other people. So we have several colleagues on the farm here. I don't think any of them is particularly likely to be online, but they go working from home. I don't think COVID's particularly funny, and there have been very few jokes about it, but this one did make me laugh. So there you go. On to the serious stuff. Next one. Okay. So why the gut in PBC? What is the connection between bowel disturbance and PBC? And it's a really interesting question. And there are a number of different ways that it can be connected. And clearly, when we talk about the gut as doctors, we talk about everything from the very top end to the very bottom end. And so clearly, there is the esophagus that connects down through the stomach, then through into the duodenum and the small bowel, and then the large bowel and out. And in simple terms, abnormality at the very top end tends to cause pain and obstruction. In the middle tends to cause absorption problems, and at the very tail end tends to cause abnormalities in the bowel habit, either constipation or diarrhea, in simple terms, although there are some exceptions for that. And so the bowel can be impacted in lots and lots and lots of different ways in PBC. Now, the first of those is that PBC is an autoimmune disease. So it's caused by the immune system malfunctioning. It's recognizing parts of the liver when it shouldn't recognize them. And the reason why people get an autoimmune condition is to an extent to do with how their immune system is built. So the genetics of immune system. So there are people with very strong immune systems. There are people with very weak immune systems. And that tends to be an inherited characteristic, a bit like height. So very powerful immune systems are something you inherit from your parents. Over the the generations, that's something that has been inherited in the population. So so one of the things that people who come and see me in the clinic will be familiar with me is posing the question, why are there no Brontes anymore? And they look at me like I'm some form of lunatic. But the point is that the Brontes, with one exception, died of TB in the 19th century. Now, everyone in the 19th century was exposed to TB. The people who survived it were the people whose immune system was able to focus on it. And the people who died from it were people who couldn't mount an immune response to it. It's in simple terms. So you survived because you mounted an immune response, and then you went on to have children, and we are the kind of offspring of people who survived it. So there are no Brontes anymore because they had probably a genetic abnormality that meant they couldn't fight an infection. So as infectious disease is out there, in generation after generation, it enriches the nature of the immune response and, if you like, the strength of it. So if you map over the last few hundred years, we see more in the way of these conditions where the immune system is hyperreactive, where it reacts against things it perhaps shouldn't and causes injury. And PBC is an example of that. And this is why people always ask me, are the genes in PBC linked to the disease? Are they abnormal? No, they're not actually. They're really normal. They're highly effective. But with every, there is always a price to be paid. It's always swings and roundabouts. So the immune system isn't wrong in PBC. In other situations, it would be right and very helpful to be able to respond in a certain way. But it does have this downside. And this downside of targeting things in the body then applies into other situations. So there are some autoimmune conditions that affect the bowel that are associated with PBC. And the most important of those is a condition called celiac disease. It's a little funny one. It's halfway between an immune response and an autoimmune response. It's a cross-reactivity between gluten and wheat and the body's own protein. So it's a sort of autoimmune response triggered by wheat. And this is probably the commonest formal bowel problem that people with PBC get. And what it does is the immune system reacts against the surface of the small bowel. And the surface of the small bowel normally has lots of finger-like structures to give you a big surface area. Those are lost, so the bowel loses surface area. And that means that you struggle to absorb your food, in simple terms. You need a lot of surface area of the bowel in the small bowel to absorb food, and you lose that. So what that does is two things. One is the food that you're not absorbing stays in the bowel. It then passes down through the bowel, and with it, it takes fluid, and so it causes loose bowel habit. Okay, so where you can't absorb your food for whatever reason, we call it malabsorption. But anything which gives you malabsorption will tend to give you loose stools, and so it is one of the causes of loose stool and diarrhea in PBC. The other side of the coin is that those nutrients that you aren't absorbing are then carried out in the bowel, and so you don't absorb them, and so you can end up with shortage of nutrition. Now that can be a general shortage, so people lose weight, so you don't absorb enough in the way of fats and amino acids and things like that. Or alternatively, it can be a shortage of very specific nutrients. So for example, it's one of the causes of iron deficiency anemia. Okay, you're not absorbing iron from your diet, and so therefore you become anemic. So it can be a shortage of certain minerals, certain vitamins and things. Vitamin D is another one. So celiac is a funny business because it can present in lots of different ways. It can present as loose bowel habit, it can present as weight loss, it can present as lack of a specific nutrient. It can even, slightly bizarrely, present with constipation. So it's one of those things that you need to think about in order to diagnose it. How do we diagnose it? We diagnose it first and foremost with a blood test. So we do an antibody test like the Pbc antibody test, and that's a very accurate screening test. In the old days, we used to do a telescope test, look down to the stomach, take a bit of the lining of the small bowel, look at it under the microscope. We tend to do that less because the antibody test is very good. And the reality is, it's something that you need to kind of think about in PBC. So it's on the radar, certainly for our clinic, and anybody with any question of this, we do the antibody testing. Oddly, it's one of those things that's in the mind of gastroenterologists managing PBC patients more than PBC. So it's one of those oddities that you're more likely to be tested for celiac than you are to get second-line treatment for PBC if you've got PBC. It's an oddity I don't quite understand. So gastroenterologists tend to be quite clued into this, and it's something to think about. It in truth, it's not that common. About 1 in 20 PBC patients will get it, about that, but you need to think about it and be aware of it. So it's one of those things that's a pretty good question. If you do have any disturbance in your bowel habit, then ask your doctor, are you sure I haven't got celiac disease? And you'll see a sort of shuffling through the notes as they check all of that, and then they do the antibody test. Colette.
Yeah, can I just ask you at this point? It's been mentioned to me a number of times in the past by various hepatologists that there's an association with celiac and PBC and people of Celtic or Irish origin. That there seems to be a higher propensity. Is that still the feeling, thought?
Yes, absolutely. So the genes, so there are specific genes that do predispose to celiac, and those are slightly different to the PBC ones. So it's a sort of mixed risk, if you like, and those genes are much commoner in particularly Western Irish origin population. So almost certainly it's to do with, in a sense, dietary pressures over time. So but it is there. It's said to be commonly associated with red hair. But in Western Ireland, about 1 in 200 people in the population have celiac. So, celiac itself is quite rare. So, it's like all of those things. It is an association, but most people from Ireland don't have celiac, and most people with celiac don't come from Ireland. But there is, more than there should be a combination of the two.
Okay, thank you.
Now, if you have got celiac disease, actually, it's really easy to treat it. You avoid gluten in your diet. So everyone will be familiar in supermarkets now. You can see shelves of gluten-free food. So a lot of food products, have gluten status on them. So life is much, much easier than it used to be for people. So it's possible to eat a diet that doesn't have any gluten in it. And that's, very effective at controlling the disease in the vast majority of people. So that is a real step forward. Just occasionally people need specific treatment for it, but it's usually because some gluten has crept in. And the Celiac Society is the equivalent of the PBC Foundation in celiac disease. And like the foundation, they do phenomenally good work. And they produce a truly unique book, which is the gluten status of every processed food you can imagine. And you think it should be easy. So how do I avoid gluten? Well, it should be obvious. It's bread, flour in its various different forms. But of course, this creeps into all manner of foodstuffs where you don't think it's going to. And my favorite example is that there are 3 different sizes of Mars bars. There are fun size, normal, and large Mars bars. Trust me, I know all about Mars bars, although not for the last 2 months, as there's been a Mars bar. But the interesting thing is 2 out of those 3 have gluten in them. 1 out of the 3 doesn't. Okay, go for it. So it can be a little bit unusual. So if people do have that, Celiac Society, fabulous resource. It is not as obvious as you think it is. And usually in people, a little bit of gluten has snuck in something that you wouldn't have begun to imagine had gluten in it. So celiac disease, much talked about. It isn't that common. Most people who get it, it's relatively mild, relatively easy to treat, but it's out there as an association. Perhaps the other immune connection is through a thing called systemic sclerosis or CREST syndrome. So one of the things that PBC can associate with is a scarring condition. Very rare, actually, even in PBC, but it can lead to some scarring in the lower esophagus, and you can get what's called bacterial overgrowth. So you can end up with complications from that. Now, normally people will have other features of this, so they'll get some finger changes, often some chalky lumps on their fingers, or some scarring in their fingers. So again, it's something that people will think about. That it's very rare, and normally it will be diagnosed after the systemic sclerosis. So in terms of associated immune conditions, celiac is the important one. Another one is thyroid disease. So thyroid disease speeds you up if you're overactive with your thyroid, or it slows you down if you're underactive. And that impacts on your bowel like everything else. So an underactive thyroid, you can get a bit constipated. An overactive thyroid, you can end up with diarrhea. But again, there are usually other features that make people suspicious of that. But you can present with weight loss and loose stool if you've got an overactive thyroid. But people have normally got a high heart rate and can feel edgy with it as well. So it usually isn't the bowel that makes people be suspicious about it. So an obvious first connection is another autoimmune condition which itself impacts on the bowel. Next slide. Okay. So the second connection is that although PBC is a liver condition, the bowel plays an important part in its life, okay? And the important part that the bowel plays is that bile acids are at the heart of both PBC and the treatment for PBC. So what are bile acids? Well, bile acids are chemicals produced by the liver, which are important for you to absorb fat from your diet. So they act like a detergent. So we're all very familiar that, you know, if you have fat on some water, it sits as a layer at the top, and if you add a little bit of washing up liquid, it suddenly dissolves. So that's a detergent effect which dissolves things which aren't soluble in water, and fat is one of those things, which means that you can't absorb it from your diet unless you have something in the body that helps make it water soluble. And nature's detergent is bile acid, okay? And it is produced by the liver. It travels in the bile, down the bile duct, out into the bowel, mixes with the food as the food goes through, out from the stomach into the small bowel, and it helps you to absorb food. Now, bile acids are based in their structure on cholesterol. So they are a variant of cholesterol, and in PBC, you underproduce bile acids, okay? So bile acid abnormalities are something which are a feature of PBC. So bile acids are quite abnormal in PBC. And that has two effects. One is it can lead people to not be hugely effective at absorbing their food. If you can't dissolve fat, then you won't absorb fat. So you can end up with a little bit of malnutrition. And again, rather like with celiac, that fatty food passes all the way down the bowel and gives you loose stools. Sometimes quite smelly with it. So it's something, again, which is quite characteristic. The other thing, of course, is that the cholesterol that isn't turned into bile acids stays in the body, and that's the reason why you get a high cholesterol value often with PBC, because if it doesn't go out into the bile, it stays in the blood. And as people will be aware, cholesterol is often high in PBC, although it's not typically the harmful cholesterol. Everyone worries about their heart, but it usually isn't an issue at all. So bile acids go out in the bile into the bowel, and they go through the bowel. So bile acids have a life in the bowel. Now, if you produced bile acids all day, every day, and they all just passed out in your bowel, you would end up losing energy very quickly. So all your cholesterol would be turned into bile acids, and you were losing them. So the body is very good at reabsorbing them. So it takes them back up again at the far end of the small bowel. So actually your bile acids go out the bile, through the small bowel, help you dissolve fat, and then get taken up again by the body, and they go back in the bloodstream to the liver, and round and round and round they go, okay? So bile acids are part of the natural history of PBC. So how does this all impact with your bowel? Well, obviously, if you don't produce the right sort or you don't produce enough bile acids, then you will struggle to absorb fat. So what's called fat malabsorption is something that we used to see quite a lot of, although I have to say it's pretty uncommon nowadays. And the reason it's uncommon is that we all, you all take bile acids as part of your treatment. So ursodeoxycholic acid is a synthetic bile acid. And what it does is two things. It gives you bile acid that you need to help absorb your food, but it also replaces some of the toxic bile acids that the body produces in the bile. So it actually is a harmless bile acid. Some of the ones that nature produces you don't want to have hanging around in your liver. They do hang around in your liver and they cause some of the liver injury, whereas urso is not harmful. And when it hangs around, it stops that injury. So it's just an inert bile acid that prevents more toxic ones hanging around in the liver. And the toxicity of bile acids, if you ever get bilious vomiting, the vomit and it's green, you always get a sickly feeling. That's the irritating effect of bile acids. So you need to have non-toxic bile acids for the liver to be happy and for your gut and nutrition to be happy. And urso allows us to do that. So it has a bit of a double-edged function. Now, our bodies do naturally produce urso, so we produce about 5% of our bile acids after our ursodeoxycholic acid. For those of you who've had a classical education, Ursa is the Latin for bear, so Ursa Major, the Great Bear, is the constellation, and ursodeoxycholic acid is the predominant bile acid in bears. And this is probably the origin of Chinese traditional medicine use of bears. But I said this once to a patient in the clinic who got very upset and wouldn't take a urso anymore. I pointed out it's now actually made in a factory in Germany, so no bears are made in the harm of ursos. It's very important to say that. It's all entirely synthetic. But that is why the bear fact is called the bear fact, because of ursodeoxycholic acid, bile acids in bears. So that's obscure fact of the day. So bile acids are essential for you to absorb food, and if you have the wrong balance, it can also drive the disease. Now, the thing that's really interesting is that, of course, as bile acids pass through your bowel, they are themselves changed potentially by the bowel. And in particular, they are metabolized by bacteria that are normally present in your bowel. So you will hear a term talked about all the time, the fecal microbiome, the gut microbiome. And this is the very large number of bacteria you normally have in your gut that live there quite happily and are actually an important part of your metabolism. So, but bile acids are modified in the gut before they're taken up again. So they are rarely the same when taken up as they are when they first appear. And at the end of all of this, I will show you some absolutely original data from UK Pbc that suggests that nobody on the call has seen, because I made the slide this morning, that this is possibly an important thing to distinguish why some people respond to urso and why some people don't. It's to do with urso being treated in different ways and creating different bile acids. Now, all of that is kind of academic interest, and at the moment it hasn't really translated into anything therapeutically, but it is something that is quite interesting. A word of warning about gut microbiome is that it is one of those things that is being invoked as an explanation of almost everything. So it's becoming the answer to many things, and I suspect it's the answer to some things, but not all disease. And you'll find virtually every disease under the sun, somebody is invoking the fecal microbiome. I do think it's potentially important to PBC for that simple reason that bile acids are integral, both as a cause of the disease and a treatment, and bile acids pass through the bowel and are exposed to it. I'm not sure how a disease of the brain or something where there is no gut component is affected, but bile acids are modified. So really interesting. Urso, interestingly, is taken up again in the colon rather than the end of the small bowel. And so it's easier for it to be taken up by the body, which is why it gets into the system. And the other oddity, which is potentially interesting, is obeticholic acid, which is OCA or Ocaliva is the standard second line treatment we use. And it itself is a bile acid, so it is prone to some of the same effects as urso is, but it has its action largely on the bowel. So it works on the bowel wall, and the bowel wall sends a signal to the liver and affects the disease. So one of the advantages of obeticholic acid over and above urso is it does not need to go all the way down through to the large bowel and be taken up to have its actions. And so some of the people who respond to OCA who don't respond to urso, it may be because it is easier for the body to respond to it. And people never talk about that, but it's potentially quite an important factor. So it is one of the ways in which OCA might work in people when urso doesn't. So bile acids go through the bowel therapeutically or naturally and may be modified in the bowel and may also impact the absorption of fat. So next one. Now, the third one is something that people very commonly talk about, is that urso itself seems to do this. It seems to give bowel disturbance. It can give upper GI pain. Remember I said the top of the bowel tends to give you pain. The lower bowel tends to give you loose stool. So urso itself can do both of those things. So it is a bile acid. I said it's a non-irritant bile acid. It's kind of a less irritant bile acid rather than a non-irritant one. And it certainly can give people quite what I call a cockly sensation, a bit of, somewhere between nausea and discomfort. The way around that is to start it very gently. If people are having problems with sickness with it, start with a very low dose and build it up over time. But it can also undoubtedly cause loose stool, although paradoxically also it can cause constipation as well. The reason for that is that it does go all the way through into the colon, and so therefore it can cause you to have more fluid in the bowel motion than is normal, and that's what gives rise to diarrhea. So bowel disturbance after starting urso is not uncommon, and it can be a problem. It's not usually a big deal. One of the other drugs that we use very occasionally in PBC is a drug called MMF. It's an immunosuppressant that really can cause loose stool. So drug effects are something to be aware of. And just occasionally, where people have got cirrhosis, we use lactulose to keep the bowel moving. And of course, too much of that will undoubtedly give you diarrhea. So just think about the impacts of the drugs that you are taking for PBC or for other conditions. So I think urso, as one of its effects is bowel disturbance, another is weight gain. It probably does that because it helps you absorb food, and the other one is hair loss, which often crops up and is as a topic, and I'm not actually sure, don't think anybody quite understands why that happens. So urso can undoubtedly do it. Remember, the deal with therapy in PBC is avoiding complications and symptoms down the line. And I think the message we always use if people are struggling with urso is try everything you can under the sun to be able to take it, because it is an important part of what we do. I think if people can't tolerate it, this cropped up, I think, the last time we did Q&A. So if you really, really can't tolerate it, and there are people who can't, obeticholic acid is licensed to be used in people who can't tolerate urso. And as I said, the dose is much smaller. You don't tend to get any GI disturbance with it. And it does work on the bowel rather than need to go through the system. So it is an important alternative. But try and take urso if you can. Lower dose, take it at different times during the day, take it with and without food. All of those things, no hard and fast rules about what works, but play around with it, because you'll often find there's a way to do it to be beneficial. Okay, next one. Now, the bowel wall is a little bit leaky in PBC. Now, don't get this wrong. It's a minor effect, but it is true, and lots of people have shown it. And one of the things that years and years ago people showed is that the components of bacteria can be found in the liver in PBC, and everyone thought were the bacteria driving PBC. I don't think they are, but I think they get there because they can end up crossing the bowel wall. In a sense, there are three ways anything gets into our bodies. One is, through the skin. One is through the lungs. And the third is through the bowel. Now, the skin is designed to be incredibly impervious. So the skin is very resistant to things getting across it. The lungs and the respiratory tract are much more vulnerable, but that's why you have tonsils and things to prevent organisms getting in. And the gut normally is resistant to big things getting across the wall because the cells that line it form a very tight layer, and the food that you take goes into the cells and out. So normally things don't get across the gut wall, they go through the gut wall, which means that bacteria and viruses are kept out, but food can get through. But in PBC, sometimes things can get around the cells and sometimes get out into the circulation. Now, the interesting thing is that doesn't seem to be restricted to the gut. It seems to be part of tight layers of cells in the body. And some of the work that we're doing is looking at another of these tissues in the body, which has tight junctions to keep cells discrete. And that's the blood-brain barrier that keeps things out of the brain. And it does appear that in diseases such as PBC, the blood-brain barrier can also become a little bit leaky. And we are wondering whether that's linked to why people get fatigue and why people get some of the brain symptoms in PBC, this slight leakiness. So the leakiness in the gut and the leakiness in the lining of the brain do seem to go together. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a very minor effect. You haven't got great holes in it that allow anything through, but it is there. Now, the reason why this is really very interesting is that obeticholic acid seems to reverse this, not urso, not bezafibrate, but obeticholic acid. And it seems to normalize, in mice at least, the blood-brain barrier. It makes it impervious again. And we are about to start a trial. What I'm going to, at 1 o'clock, when I have to leave at 5 to 1, is to chair a meeting about a trial that we are about to launch called the OAKS trial, obeticholic acid in cognitive symptoms, which is precisely to treat brain symptoms in PBC to see if use of OCA earlier can reverse that effect. So we think this is real. Not sure what the impact is in the gut, but we think it may be important in the brain. So this is definitely there. The significance isn't clear, but we're going to have some trial data fairly soon, which I think will be very interesting. Next one. Okay, now, as people will know from when I've talked about these things and given talks before, I have a major focus on quality of life and thinking about all of those things that quality of life might be impacted in PBC and what we can do about them. And this is a deeply practical thing. I would love to have a single therapy that makes all symptoms in PBC go away, but I don't have one. And so what we do is look for anything and everything that makes symptoms worse and that we can do something about. And as I said, very practical, and it's a lot of common sense. So for example, itch at night is associated with fatigue because people can't sleep because they've got bad itch, and so therefore tend to be awake and therefore tired the next day. So that's why treating itch, if people have got it, will often be very useful for treating fatigue. Clearly, if you have loose bowel motions, if you're getting up 2 or 3 times a night to have diarrhea, or if you've got crampy abdominal pain, then that is going to disturb your sleep, and therefore it's going to make your quality of life worse because you're going to have discomfort, you're going to have sleep disturbance, you're going to have fatigue the next day from it. So actually, loose bowel motions are themselves a cause of poor quality of life, and so therefore are worthy of treating. And so actually, it's one of those things, a bit like dry eyes, that has an impact on general quality of life that people kind of need to just think about and be aware of. So bowel symptoms of direct effect, loose stool at night, which wakes you up, or fatigue from anemia from celiac, all of those things can make your quality of life worse directly or indirectly and are therefore worth treating. So it's one of those things that we want to track down and treat because it may have knock-on effects. Next one. And this is the last of my important observations. So there are lots of different connections, but the last one is there may be no connection. And one of the things that doctors always do is they always end up answering a different question to the one you asked. And doctors are programmed to think about certain things in certain ways. And where people's bowel habit changes, one of the things that we are trained to think about is things that could cause this that are treatable and important to diagnose. In a sense, loose bowel motions as a sign that there is something going on we need to do something about. So we can sometimes switch into thinking about what it could be rather than what it is. And then we prove that it isn't what it could be, but we don't then answer what it is. And I'm sure a lot of people will be very familiar with that sensation, is that the doctor goes off and answers a different question to the one you ask. But it is an important question, and it's one that we need to think about, because having PBC doesn't impact on your risk of having bowel cancer, which is unfortunately one of the commoner types of cancers that we see. And the importance about bowel cancer is it's really easy to treat early in the disease. It starts as polyps, and those polyps are very easily removed at colonoscopy, at a telescope test. And so, yes, where people have an altered bowel habit, we need to think about why it's connected to PBC, but we also need to remember why it might not be connected to PBC, and do we need to investigate this? And this is the reason why we will often end up doing colonoscopy in people, even though we don't suspect there's anything untoward behind it, is that every once in a while you'll find a polyp doing that, and you will change the course of somebody's life. So just because you've got PBC, it doesn't stop it being other important things to be aware of. Now, what makes us more worried about bowel cancer in somebody? Family history of bowel cancer is an important thing. A history of colitis is an important thing. The presence of blood in the stool is an important thing, and weight loss. Now, the important thing, as I've just said, is that where you've got an absorption problem, be it from bile acids or from celiac, you can lose weight and get loose bowel motions with it. So it is really important to track those things down, because it's that combination of weight loss and loose stool. The one thing something like celiac will never do is give you bleeding into the bowel. And so therefore, in particular, the presence of that makes us concerned. And if at the end of the day we do a colonoscopy every couple of years, we do a colonoscopy every couple of years. In America, screening for bowel cancer is universal, actually, through telescope tests beyond a certain age every 2 to 5 years. So there's an argument for it. So where we do that, bear with us. Nobody likes the thought of a colonoscopy. Nobody likes a colonoscopy, but trust me, you like bowel cancer even less. So it is well worth doing it. The kind of good news is, and I'll finish with this, that the good news is that there is no association between PBC and bowel cancer, okay? In fact, there's no association between PBC and any cancer other than liver cancer in the small group of people with advanced cirrhosis. So having PBC doesn't make it more likely you'll get pretty much any type of cancer, but nor does it protect you against it. So there is no particular reason we worry about bowel cancer and PBC, other than we worry about bowel cancer in everybody because it's one of the important and treatable types of cancer. So there is nothing specifically to be worried about with PBC. The caveat is that there is an association between PSC, primary sclerosing cholangitis, and bowel cancer. PSC is a completely different condition, but it is sometimes one that is not diagnosed properly. The giveaway is AMA, the anti-mitochondrial antibody in PBC. The moment you have that antibody, then it's PBC, and instantly the other risks go away. So we just need to, we do live in a world where unfortunately people do develop these types of cancers. The risk is pretty low if you haven't got any of the risk factors for it, but we just need to be aware of it. So the final connection is that there is no connection. So next slide and last slide. And I promised you some original data, and this is essentially the blue blobs are people with a good prognosis with URSO and PBC, and this is the UK PBC study. There'll be many people on the call who took home the little bags and collected stool specimens and put them in their freezer, much as people didn't like doing it, but this is the data from it. The blue blobs are stools from people who have responded well to URSO, and the red blobs are people who've responded badly. And these are different types of bile acids. And the one that's fifth down is taurolithicolic acid. The nature of it doesn't matter, but as you can see, both bile acid levels in the stool are identical. The blue blob and the red blob are on top of each other. So that's what it should look like. If you took 100 people in the ordinary population, that's what it would look like. But if you take people who have responded to URSO and people who haven't responded to URSO, I think we can all agree that these pictures are very different, okay? We are really interested in this because it suggests that in stool, the bile acid picture is very different. Now, what I haven't shown you, because it gets very complicated and it's quite difficult to show, is that this is mirrored by a change in bowel organisms. So the gut microbiome is different in keeping with this. So what does this tell us? That bile acids in people are different between responders and non-responders. And if you look at the second one down, that is a metabolite of URSO. So remember I said that URSO could be being handled differently in people who respond and don't respond? This is exactly it. Now, I don't know what this means, and I don't think it changes what we do at the moment, but it suggests that this idea that the bowel is implicated and that bile acids passing through the bowel being handled in different ways is an important part of it all. And it probably indicates that the fecal microbiome must be one of the areas where that's important in PBC and PBC important in it. So watch this space. We are at the moment working out what to do with this information, but the net result, I suspect, is this does give us a question mark about URSO and how it's handled by the body. And so therefore it makes a particular reason why you should think about taking obeticholic acid if you've not responded to URSO, because it does not need to go through the bowel to work. So that distinction is very important. So it may be in people not responding to URSO or not responding enough to URSO. It may be that the URSO is being rendered ineffective by the body. So OCA is the obvious way to bypass it. So I thought I would finish it was a bit of a verbal stroll around gardens. I hope it was vaguely sensible. Well, I see we've got a lot of questions that will go into some of these issues, but I just thought I would show a bit of data from UK PBC as to where this is going. So at that point, I will shut up and take questions.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to say, everybody, David, we have about over 200 people in just now. There's lots of questions coming up.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to say to people, we'll do the very best we can to get through these questions. If we don't, and you know that Professor Jones is on a time barrier here, if we don't, I'll have a chat with Dave later on and we'll figure out something. So do not worry, one way or the other. If not today, we'll make sure they're all dealt with. Okay, shoot, you're on, Robert.
And I will focus, Robert, on quick answers. You know me, I'm Mr. Quick Answer.
Give him a Mars bar.
I'm not allowed, honestly. 2 months I've been good. No Mars bars.
You're cured of the sugar addiction then. If you had one.
I'm a recovering sugar addict, so rather like a recovering alcoholic. I am one. Actually, for me, it's not sugar; it's Greg's sausage rolls. I am one Greg's sausage roll away from a total relapse. Okay.
Okay. Shall we open up the screen then? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. A magnum addiction.
Robert, you're muted.
£10.
Another £10. So honestly, the money I'm saving by not commuting is it's going away on muting fines. Right. People have heard about intermittent fasting, so fasting for more than 12 hours. Now, in the olden days, we were told to eat little and often. So where do we sit with either of those two principles?
So I'll let you into a secret. I fast for more than 12 hours every day. I've managed to lose just under 2 stone in weight since before Christmas. So partly that's iron discipline and avoiding Greg's sausage rolls, and partly it's doing that. I think in terms, I'll split that into a PBC question and a kind of more general question. So PBC, I don't think for most people that there is any issue one way or the other. So I remember the days I first started. So somebody said Magnum addiction. I'm with you on that, actually, because I've personally found one of the raspberry ones would just finish off the Greg sausage rolls beautifully. So, I'm with you. Yeah. So so in terms of when I first started in PBC in Oliver James's clinic, so we would see absorption problems all the time. So we used to see people really struggle with low body weight, people with 35 or 40 kilos, and actually, interestingly, often, short as well. So presumably had nutritional problems all their life. And we used to see that, not frequently, but it was certainly there. And we don't see that commonly now. We do see it occasionally. And I'm not sure what's gone away. I think it might be everything. So I think it might be the effect of urso. I think it might be that we transplant people with very advanced disease. And I think it might be that we're spotting celiac and treating it earlier. So most people do not have a nutritional problem with PBC. A small group do, but most people don't. And on average, you don't need to modify diet at all with PBC. So the right thing to do for all of this is get the right PBC treatment. So urso, etc., 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 is the right thing. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is where people do have nutritional issues. I think the key thing here is either loss of body weight or a specific nutritional deficiency like iron deficiency or a vitamin deficiency. Then the other thing that's really improved out of all recognition is dietetics in the last 10 years. So specialist dietitians now are fantastic at giving people dedicated diets around this. So one of our dietitians just got a PhD fellowship to look at nutritional support in complex health conditions. So it's improved out of all recognition. So for most people, you actually should eat what you want and eat how you want. And if your body weight is normal, then you're very lucky, and there isn't a particular issue. So for most people, this is something they can cope with okay. I think if you've got loose bowel motions, then you need to think about it differently. In terms of where people want to lose weight, you need my wife here. So my wife is an anaesthetist and intensivist, and she's obsessed with low carb diets and things like that. So she, I obey, obviously. I'm a sensible person. So, and I have to say, it's been transformative. So I did this because of her, and actually it becomes much easier when you do it, and it means that it is an effective way to lose weight. I don't think having PBC particularly impacts on diet and weight loss approaches in general, with the caveat that with cirrhosis everything changes. So with cirrhosis, you are less effective at buffering sugar. So normally you eat a meal, it gets taken up, deposited in the liver, and then it gets released in between meals. So it smooths out the blood sugars. If you're cirrhotic, you lose that effect. So your sugars can go high. Your sugars can go high after a meal and then low in between meals. So with cirrhosis, you need to be more cautious. But 95% of people who don't have cirrhosis. So fasting and things like that is something that goes in and out of fashion for weight loss. Personally, I'm not an expert, but I have found it as an effective tool. I think, but the difficulty is, you get very contradictory advice. The standard guidance, okay, there is a national, I think we all realize at the moment that all aspects of our life are being dictated, but there is a national guidance on the thing called the Eat Well plate, which is a balanced diet. And so you're absolutely right, little and often of a balanced diet is the national guidance, but there are counter views to this. And I think this is highly relevant in NASH, where in fatty liver disease, where these sorts of fasting-based things have proved quite effective, and we've got people looking at all of this. So the answer is I couldn't comment officially. I have found it quite a useful thing myself.
And I would add to that, anecdotally, and Jen has just put that up, she does the 16-8, and I've fallen into that for whatever reason. I hear a lot of this on the telephone. It does help fatigue doing that, and it's fasting, and it actually doesn't feel like fasting. But I'm also going to say, and it's something we can discuss another time, that there is no doubt that refined carbohydrates, excesses of white rice, white pasta, white bread, it does cause weight problems, and there's no doubt it adds to fatigue. But that's for another time. We need to address that too, David. It's a biggie, an absolute biggie. And the weight gain. And if you stop doing that, you have less of an appetite, much more balanced diet, more energy, less weight.
Yeah, I think weight gain. I think, you know, and obviously I'm a person who's triumphed over this throughout my entire life, as you all know. So, you know, do as I say, not as I do. The net result, in simple terms, we tend to overeat, and you know, I think it's as simple as that. But our bodies also get used to certain patterns of eating, and I think I would agree with completely. It is complex carbohydrates and things like that. It's too easy a source of nutrition, and I think this is not particularly a PBC issue. I think it's more of an issue in NASH. But it is the way in which we take our calorie load that has an impact. And I think NASH is a disease of the modern world. So fatty liver disease, it's a disease of the modern world. In that modern world, it is too easy to get too high a calorie load, which is too easy to metabolize. It's just quite interesting, actually, that one of the themes that we are talking about in liver disease is we talk about alcoholic liver disease, but there is an entity which I think is real, which is non-alcoholic liver disease, which is where it is the metabolic load of alcohol that is causing the problem rather than the toxic effects of alcohol. So if you drink a lot of alcohol, and I know, you know, this is not an issue with PBC at all, very important to say that. I'm saying this because people will be interested. If you drank, you know, went to the pub and drank 5 pints of Coke a night, you would get alcoholic liver disease, I think, because alcohol is a source of calories. So I think it probably is, at the end of the day. The issue about URSO and weight gain, I know it's been touched on in comments. I think this is personally that your body, I think the game changer for why we don't see weight loss, you know, significant weight loss issues with PBC anymore is URSO. So if I look at what we have done, so I first did a PBC clinic in 1991. I know. I must have been about 10 or 11 at the time, so I was very young for it.
Baby boy.
In 1991, we used to see this, and we don't see it anymore. Yeah. Interestingly, we also used to see specific vitamin deficiencies. So we used to see a lot of shortage of vitamin A, as well as vitamin D. And we don't see that anymore either. Vitamin D we do, but that's because we avoid sun a lot. Sunlight. But vitamin A, we used to see real issues with it. We don't anymore. And again, it's because of fat absorption. And I think the game changer has been URSO. And I think what we've done with URSO is take people whose bodies have become used to being starved. So I think when you have PBC, before you start URSO, what happens is your body adapts. So we're all familiar with dieting, losing weight, and then you put the weight back on and actually goes back to beyond where it was to start with. And that's because you train your body when you're dieting to cope in a starvation mode. And I think having PBC for 10 years or 5 years before it's diagnosed, you start URSO, your body is adapted to not getting as much nutrition as it would normally want. And so it goes into a sort of compensatory mode. And when you start URSO, what's happening is all of a sudden you absorb your food normally. So it is a catch up and overshoot rather than anything else. So I don't think URSO causes you to gain weight. I think URSO is normal. Well, it does, but I think it is normalizing a previously abnormal state rapidly. And so it's therefore something to be very cautious about when you start URSO. the danger that you will overshoot. So I don't think it's a side effect of urso. It's paradoxically an effect, if you like. And I think the flip side of no longer seeing the really low body weight problems is we are seeing people tending to gain weight with it. So I think it's one to be very aware of.
Okay, keep going.
Now, I'm aware, so we have people in North America, we have people in Europe, we have people in Asia and Australasia, and we have a ton of questions. So just to publicly say that because we do the Thursday 2 p.m s, we're going to focus on gut questions. Yep. And if we have time at the end, we'll do general PBC questions. But if not, we will carry them over to the Thursday at 2 p.m.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I've been told I have Barrett's.
Yeah.
But I've been told they don't have it anymore. So they've had it for 20 years. They don't have it anymore because the criteria has changed. So does this mean it's completely gone or too small to measure, or any thoughts?
So Barrett's so Barrett's esophagus for people, it's not associated with PBC.
Okay.
But I think it's important. So it is where you get a change in the lower gullet related to acid reflux, and it is really important. So I'm going to talk about it because it's really important. So Barrett's can predispose to esophageal cancers. Okay, that's why it's important, but it is fully controllable with therapies. Okay, so using anti-acid therapies, it's one of those things that is much less common because of really effective treatment. So like lansoprazole, omeprazole, pantoprazole, etc., etc., etc. So where people have Barrett's or have been told they've got Barrett's, take it seriously, because it is one of those things where treating it will prevent cancer developing. It will go away with really effective therapy. It all depends on what you see down the endoscope, but if in doubt, you treat it. And if it's gone away, brilliant. It's because you've managed to control it with tablets and weight loss and things. But if it is there, it's one of those things you must treat it because it will make a major, major difference. The best way to control reflux, I used to get reflux. I lost 2 stone in weight. I don't get reflux anymore. So intra-abdominal pressure is very important. So it is one of those things that you don't expect when you lose weight, is that it will help things like reflux. So worth being aware of that. So Barrett's, take it seriously.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. What I'm going to do at the end of the session is I'm going to come back and talk about the caveats of cirrhosis and post-transplant.
Yep.
But we'll do that towards the end because there are people asking, what about this in post-transplant? What about that? So I will come back and ask for a general summary for both cirrhosis and transplant.
Yes.
Diverticulitis. Is there a link between PBC and diverticulitis? Can PBC trigger diverticulitis?
No.
Any thoughts? Okay. No. Perfect.
Unlinked. But remember, the diverticulitis is a great mimic. It gives you altered bowel habit. It can give you rectal bleeding, and it can give you abdominal pain. And it is sometimes very difficult to distinguish it from cancers. That's why we take it very seriously, as well as the problems with it. But it's not associated with PBC.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. There's an organization in the US called Zoe, Z-O-E, and they're linked to a guy called Tom Spector. What they are doing is looking at your individual gut bacteria and eating patterns, and based on science, are looking at individuals just for you. Now, I don't know if this is a gimmick or if it's genuinely based in science. It is coming over to the UK. Have you heard of it? Are you any thoughts on it?
Tim Spector's London. He's King's, isn't he, David?
The Zoe app. Yeah, isn't the Zoe app? That's COVID, isn't it?
They took it to use for COVID, but it's actually originated for the gut. It was Dr. Tim Spector, the King's guy, the twins researcher,
Okay. Right. Okay. So, I mean, the individual fecal microbiome. I think the distinction here is between population effects and individual effects. So if you take 1,000, so the data I've shown you, we're all pretty convinced those blobs are different, but that's 400 people, okay, to get that clarity. And within that, there will be people who go the different way. So extrapolating from a large group to an individual is always very difficult. And I personally don't think the science is quite there yet. So what does the microbiome in an individual tell you about their individual risk? I'm not so sure. And it's a little bit like the genetics here. So when we talk about the Pbc genes, okay, remember, there is no Pbc gene. There is no gene that predisposes to Pbc. What there are is a whole number of variants of normal that all have a small risk associated with it. They're usually an odds ratio of what we call about 1.2 or 1.3. So if you have that variant of a gene, you've got 1.2 times the chance of getting PBC compared to somebody who doesn't have it. Now, to an individual, that change is insignificant. You can't do anything with that information. And there are people who've got 20 of those who have a high risk of PBC, but the vast majority of PBC patients don't have 20 of those. It's why these gene tests aren't useful for diagnosis, because most people with PBC don't have the gene variant. Most people with the gene variant don't have PBC. But if you look at 1,000 people, there'll be an association. So it's this concept you need to extrapolate from the whole to the individual is quite difficult. When I look at the microbiome data, there is an awful lot of variation between people. So the reason I didn't show you the microbiome data is it's really difficult to follow. And it will be very difficult to pluck an individual out from that and know what their disease sort of means. It's like many of these things is that it is robust science. The data are correct. You have this particular organism, but they are all variants of normal. And to go from that to an intervention which changes that is quite a challenge. So for me, the science isn't quite there yet, but I don't know enough about the specifics of what they're doing. But it's a bit like people getting their genotyping done. It kind of tells you those things that you are more likely to get versus those things you are less likely to get, but it does not tell you what you're going to get. And therefore, it's quite difficult to use the information.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Question coming in with regard to probiotics. Now, we've recently seen studies come out that probiotics have, all sorts of benefits, including
yes.
mental health and all those kind of things. So any thoughts on probiotics and PBC?
Okay, and then can I then, Robert, can I just answer the question about the new technique on resurfacing bile ducts? So just because I think that's important because it came out in the last week or so. Okay. So, yep. Right. Probiotics. So what probiotics do is it's a bit like turning the TV off and on again if it isn't working. It resets the gut microbiome. Okay. So what happens with the gut microbiome is that events can change it. It's like a coral reef. It's a collection of individual organisms that exist as an entity, and things can change it. And in particular, antibiotics can change it, or illness can change it, or nutrition can change it. Almost certainly bile acids change it, and then it changes bile acids. So you can reset it with probiotics. So if you take probiotics, what they will do is in a sense, boost the ability for benign bacteria to dominate compared to unhelpful bacteria. Yeah. And in its extreme form is a thing called fecal microbiome transplant, where you literally can transplant organisms into the gut. So probiotics are a sort of lower impact version of that. So it's a reset, if you like, on the microbiome. Now, the link with things, so in that sense, there is absolutely a logic in PBC, but there is no trial evidence at all. And it's the sort of thing that it would be, really quite good for us to look at. There was a guy called Mark Swain, who a number of you will have come across. So Mark is a very good friend of mine and does really good PBC research in Canada. And he's actually done a trial on probiotics. When I said there's no evidence, actually it's not. There is one study. And there is a particular probiotic that they showed real benefits with. So I think it's not been much explored, but I think if you can dig that out, Colette, and put the link in, I think they're the only people I know who've looked at this. And I think it's very interesting. So it is a low impact. And if we're going to return, it's what I call returning physiology to normal. So if there is an abnormality, if we get rid of all the abnormalities, you must have normality. I mean, I know it's a semi-philosophical point, but sometimes we can't cure a condition, but we can take out all the abnormalities and it's de facto the same. And so I think there's an interesting value in it. And I think maybe Mark Swain's data is the most important one.
He was the first one to come up with movement as medicine, and he's very handsome. Moving on.
Sorry, and your point is what?
So
again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I'm now going to leave this call because I've been.
Oh, you're very handsome too.
No, seriously, he is the George Clooney of hepatology, isn't he? Really?
Yeah.
No, Mark is a very, very good and very caring clinician. So he is probably, in terms of mindset to approach the disease, closest to me probably of anybody. Is very, very thoughtful of. About these things. Does a lot of fatigue research. They do a lot of the MR techniques looking at people's brains, and this will amuse people. So their resource came from the people who owned the Calgary Flames ice hockey team, and the reason was to investigate why there was chronic fatigue in ice hockey players after they retired. And they did the first work on what we now know as being the concussion thing in rugby and football. And of course, the people from North America will know the old joke about I went to a fight and an ice hockey game broke out, and it was literally because they knocked lumps out of each other. They were the first group to where this concussion was did, and that led to it all. In terms of mood and things, I think this is really interesting because there is a thread of research that I actually believe completely around gut permeability. It goes back to our friend gut permeability. And remember I said in PBC you have gut permeability and you have blood-brain barrier permeability. The blood-brain barrier permeabilizes easily in various different situations. So ironically, after head injury, where people get concussion and memory problems afterwards, it's associated with leaks in the blood-brain barrier that then heal themselves. So and there is a literature about depression and mood problems and blood-brain barrier permeability. And we think the same process that happens in the gut happens there. So it's part of a multi-system effect. And our Oaks trial that I mentioned in PBC, looking at cognitive symptoms, is also looking at Parkinson's disease for that precise reason. Because in Parkinson's disease, you get gut permeability and you get blood-brain barrier permeability. And what we want to know is if obeticholic acid seals the gut and the blood-brain barrier in PBC, does it also do it in Parkinson's disease? So it's a very left field thing. So I think that's an important thing. So I think the gut, I think there are two bits to the gut and the microbiome. One is the nature of the microbiome, and the other is the nature of the barrier function that the gut does and doesn't have. And I am a fan of healing the barrier, perhaps more than modifying the gut components, although I do think there's mileage in probiotics.
Brilliant. All right, that's helpful. Thank you. You wanted to very quickly address the resurface the damaged ducts.
Yes.
Technology.
So this was in the news this week. So this is both important and important to contextualize. So this is very basic research. This is some considerable distance off being usable in people, but this is using stem cells to, quotes, regrow the bile ducts. The answer to PBC is to prevent the loss of bile ducts in the first place, okay? And this is something that may be applicable to a small number of people with advanced disease, but everything about modern therapeutics in PBC, urso, OCA, bezafibrate, all the therapies that are now coming along are designed to prevent you losing the bile ducts in the first place. And almost certainly the big advance in PBC will be better treatment earlier, prevent these problems from ever arising. Diagnose it earlier, treat it earlier, stop this ever being an issue. So I think it is really interesting science. There will be a group of people in whom it's applicable, but to take our eye off the ball of better treatment earlier because there is a salvage procedure is to miss the point that actually this is now preventable. Everything we're doing now and the numbers of people going forward for transplant with modern therapies is going down and down and down. And basically, drugs like obeticholic acid cause you to regrow your own bile ducts. And I personally would be much happier to regrow my own bile ducts than I would be to have somebody else's. So I think it's interesting science, but I think the more prosaic approach is to make sure that you actually treat the disease better. So I would hate it if people had their eye taken off the ball of simple things done well earlier because there is a sort of glamorous solution down the line. That's what I wanted to say. It's very clever science for people presenting very late and potentially, you know, with other ductopenic diseases, such as PSC, it may be very important. But PBC, actually, we should be looking at the other end of the disease process.
Okay.
Okay, brilliant. That's helpful. Thank you. So to come back on to PBC in the gut. So lots of people are talking about Crohn's, IBS, IBD, and those types of symptoms. So I know you spoke earlier in general terms, but is there a little more you can give to people either with those overlaps?
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Or with symptoms.
Okay. So I'll take Crohn's and colitis first. So these are what are known as inflammatory, and here terminology can be slightly unhelpful. So those are what are known as collectively as inflammatory bowel disease, and those are essentially autoimmune conditions of the bowel. Okay, they are probably a bit like celiac. They are the response of the body to things in the bowel, possibly bacteria. So, but they are, by the time they clinically present, are autoimmune conditions. Colitis, as its name implies, affects the colon. Crohn's disease can affect anywhere in the bowel from the mouth all the way through to the colon, and has different forms to it. The classical Crohn's everyone thinks about is the very end of the small bowel where you can get swelling and obstruction for it. Now, I said that autoimmune diseases are, you see autoimmune diseases in PBC. The one thing you don't see at an increased rate is inflammatory bowel disease. So IBD is not associated with PBC. It is not associated with PBC. It's neither more common nor rarer than it would be in the general population. The instant anybody has IBD diagnosed, however, and a diagnosis of PBC, you must question the PBC diagnosis because there is a strong association between IBD and PSC. Okay, so clang, clang, clang go the alarm bells. Now, I have got people in the clinic who have both IBD and PBC. So clearly, two diseases will occur randomly in the same person. But clang, clang, clang go the alarm bells, and I would instantly go back to why I diagnosed PBC and be certain that it wasn't PSC. The reason is the combination of inflammatory bowel disease. Inflammatory bowel disease is associated with a colon cancer risk, and the moment it's associated with PSC, that risk goes up. So it's really important to make that. Now, most times when you do that, there you are, you've got somebody who's AMA positive, who's got classic PBC symptoms, and it is a coincidence. But it is one of those massive traps to be aware of. So those are inflammatory conditions, autoimmune diseases. They happen not to be associated with PBC, but they are associated with PSC, and they are obviously much commoner in the population than PBC is. So they are important diseases in their own right. IBS sounds a bit like IBD, but it is completely different. It's irritable bowel syndrome, and it is a catch-all term for problems of mobility of the gut, okay? And in simple terms, this is all to do with how giraffes drink water, which you probably haven't thought about before. But obviously, when a giraffe drinks water, you have to go, the water has to go uphill, up the esophagus of the giraffe before it reaches the stomach. And so therefore, what happens when the gut works is one bit contracts and then the next bit beyond that relaxes. So it's like squeezing toothpaste. So you need a squeeze that goes all the way through. So the giraffe's gullet, the esophagus, squeezes behind the water and then squeezes all the way through to kind of milk the water up the gullet. So gut function needs the gut to contract and relax in a coordinated fashion. Now, IBS is where that doesn't happen. It becomes discoordinated. And the problem is that happens for a number of different reasons, but the terminology is really, so it's a bit like fatigue as a diagnosis. It isn't a diagnosis, it's a symptom. And you need to think about the diagnosis. So IBS in this setting can be caused by PBC. So it can be caused by bile acids. So when we talk about the gut irritation with bile acids, actually that's a variant of IBS. You also get hypermobility after an infection. So post-infectious irritability can do it. So it is a description of what's going on. Now, the important thing about IBS is several things. One is it is a symptom that warrants treatment in its own right, so it can be uncomfortable. And so therefore, you know, with my quality of life focus approach to life, you need to treat it. But it can also cause, you know, worries because it's altered bowel habit and so on that makes people worry about cancers. So it's something we end up investigating. The giveaways are you won't normally get any weight loss with it. You certainly won't get any rectal bleeding with it. So it is something that warrants treatment if it's symptomatic, but it is a symptomatic problem. But it is a dysmotility phenomenon, and dysmotility can be triggered by disease states such as PBC. So there is an association between that, but it's kind of an indirect one. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. But it's something I hear about an awful lot over the phone, David, is bowel issues. But in both ways, the same person, you know, too much, too little, doesn't move, moves too much. It's a very common conversation.
Yes, exactly. Now, it's an area of it's a difficult one for therapy. So one of the treatments you can use are anti-motility agents. So we use agents that slow the gut down. Now, you know, in a sense, what you're doing is you can take away crampy pains with that. So if you've got two bits of the bowel that squeeze at the same time and the bit in the middle that isn't squeezing, you can get pain from that. So those sorts of drugs are quite useful for settling crampy pains, but they do so by slowing the bowel down. And remember that you're as likely to get constipation as you are to get loose bowel with irritable bowel syndrome. So it's a different bowel phenomenon, if you like. So I think so those have a use, but they have, you know, problems as well as advantages. There is hypnotherapy which is used. This is about, in a sense, trying to reset and coordinate it. I've seen practitioners have worked with that very well, so that can work, but it can be difficult to access on the NHS. There are people for whom dietary exclusion certainly used to be used. So there are certain people in whom the dysmotility is caused by different foodstuffs. So dietary exclusion can sometimes work. It's not usually obvious what it is, but I've certainly seen that work, you know, over the years in people. And there is a whole raft of newer therapies coming along which are around transmitters in the gut. The problem is it's a bit like hitting a computer with a hammer. The gut is a very complex structure that needs to coordinate its function, and switching off one bit is rarely the answer because it's the coordination that is the problem.
Okay, perfect. That's helpful.
I'm not an expert on it at all, though, but I do recognize those symptoms in people.
Yeah.
And I think my first port of call always, I think a lot of these things are caused by URSO, and I think exploring different ways of taking URSO, and don't be frightened of this. We manage URSO on the basis of the blood response to it. So although people say take it at night, take it during the day, split it, don't split it, the answer is however it works for you is the right way to take it. So it is one of those things that I suggest to people to perhaps think about just ringing the changes with it. And I am interested in whether OCA is an answer to some of these things, because I'll come back to what I said before. It reduces, so the standard dose of URSO is 1,000 milligrams. 1,000 milligrams. The standard dose of OCA is 5 milligrams. Now, they work in different ways, and so so you can't directly compare them, but it's 1,000 milligrams of bile acid going through the gut versus 5 milligrams of bile acid working at the top of the gut. So it is a significant reduction in bile acid load.
Perfect, thank you.
Very aware of time.
Yeah, I am aware of time. So I've very quickly, how can somebody get involved in the brain leakage trial?
So it is going to be in 2 forms, one in Newcastle, one across the UK. So if people want to drop me an email, they're more than welcome to. So it's going to be at 4 centres across the UK later this year. And I think it's an interesting one. So yeah, just drop me an email.
Very quickly, too much gas, wind, and also bad breath in relation to stomach issues and gut issues.
So bad breath is sometimes caused by mouth issues, which are caused by poor saliva production. So the first thing to do is to just be aware of the fact that saliva is antibacterial. And so one of the reasons why we produce saliva with a lot of bicarbonate in it is to keep the mouth clean. So there is a danger that can be a problem with people. So so I think, you know, careful mouth hygiene is very important. The oral people don't like us using mouthwash, but it's one of those situations where it may actually be useful because but good care and actually drinking plenty of fizzy water, which has sort of bicarbonate in it, is something that you can do. Acid reflux can sometimes do it, so just be aware of that. So a trial of some of the acid suppressing treatments, so the PPIs, again, lansoprazole and things are useful. Gas is part of the IBS dysmotility thing. So it's part of this discoordinated function. So it's part of that bigger spectrum of problems. And Robert's most important point to me is track these symptoms. One of the things that is very important is the symptoms of PBC are an organic thing. So fatigue does it, itch does it, but gut symptoms do it. Track them, because therapies for these things will have an effect over time. So it's not like pain which is no longer there. Sometimes with itch, you know, it stops being there, you know, after transplant and things, but it is change over time, and that time aspect does need to track. So it's tracking how it is. So we all remember what we remember, and sometimes we remember things differently to how they were at the time. So
use the app, use the Pbc app.
That's right. So the work that the foundation have done with the app is invaluable with this, because it allows you to track that information. So actually, was it worse in March last year than it is this year? It allows you to track back. So don't expect miracle effects on symptoms. I wish we could, but it is this progressive change over time is the key thing. So the app is absolutely configured to do that. So it's one of the most important things the foundation have done. So I encourage you.
I'm going to let you go, David, because you need to get a cup of tea before your next meeting. David, thank you so much. I've got an idea about the rest of the questions, but I'll email you later on, okay?
Yes, and we'll pick this up on that.
And I just want to say thank you so much. Bye. I'm worried about you, David. Being a mother together.
Thursday afternoons, they're about every month, 2 o'clock. We go into
we've got George this week.
Widest range of areas you can possibly imagine, but we've never done giraffes, so that's a new one today. But we can pick up a number of these questions and the broader things at that point, if that's
okay. I've got an idea.
I've got half a dozen other people on the line waiting for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got an idea. I'll email you later. Bye. Thank you.
Hope that was interesting for people.
All right. Thanks. We'll close up. Thank you, sir.
So to everybody, thank you so much for joining us.
I'll log you out.
David's questions. We will. I've got an idea. Robert, thanks so much. That was a lot of technical things going on there, and I can see the questions coming in. So you've played a storm as usual. Now, listen, everybody. This has cost us quite a lot of money today. We've got a lot of people in. If you can donate, I'd be really, really grateful. Our funds are going down, and we want to keep up these services. So please, could you donate to the foundation? Just go online or send us a check or whatever. Robert, I'll let you know once I've emailed David what the response is about the questions. We'll get them all answered. I promise, everybody, we will. He's played a stormer, hasn't he? And
No,
I will find that research, Mark Swain, Robert, on the probiotics as well. Okay.
Indeed. So one of the key things I want to say is there were some general PBC questions which we will not ignore. We will carry them over and we'll make sure they're asked early on Thursday. So again, you know, all around the world, the fact that it's now 1 p.m. in the UK, but people were joining us 4:30 in the morning in the US.
Amazing.
People were joining us at nighttime in Asia and Australia. So thank you so much. We're delighted that we can offer you this kind of information, this kind of live interactive service where you get your questions answered and your fears and concerns addressed. I can't tell you how happy we are that you're able to join us. And Chief, thank you for everything you've got to do.
No, and it's fine. And you know, we've run out of time, but when you look at how he answers the questions and listen to what he's saying, Robert, he goes into great detail. He absolutely cares about what he's saying and how it's being received. So I don't know about you people, I feel very, very privileged to be in the company and to have people like David work for us and with us. It's great. So listen, everybody, promise, we'll get on to this. I'll have a chat with Robert later on and I'll get an email down to David and either Robert will be able to tell you, probably not, but I can let you know tomorrow, but we'll keep you fully informed. Robert, thanks so much. Go and have a rest. You've got busy 2 days on the line. Okay?
So just before you go, people are asking for Dave's address. If you have any questions for Dave,
send them to the foundation.
Send them to the foundation. So just put for Professor Jones in the title, and then it's info@pbcfoundation.org.uk. That's info. And
we will wrap them up, and they'll be part of my plan. Okay, but we will wrap them up. We'll send them on for them and make it easy for them. Okay, that's what we're here to do. Okay, Robert, right, almost that person. I'm going for a wee walk now. I think it's just everybody get a wee bit fresh air. Thank you, everybody. Robert, can you close this? Can I get you to do that?
No problem. Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thanks
again.
Bye,
everyone. Thanks again. Take care.
Okay, bye.